like to formally welcome everyone to our webinar. And today's title is 10 Predictions for 2018. I think it's going to be a fascinating year. I think the speed of change in the industry is moving at probably at a faster pace than I've seen for a lot of time. Yes. I think that Omni-Channel that's been talked about, or multi-channel, is really here to stay, and I think is really quite become quite transformational. There's some new technologies. Robotization, I think there's a whole vast array of areas that I think are going to be interesting. I think that's judged by the number of people that have registered for this webinar and have already dialed in. We're already at 118 people in the webinar, so I think is very popular. So I'd like to introduce you to speakers old and new. Delighted to welcome back Martin Hill-Wilson from Brain Food Consulting.
Thank you.
And Martin, as ever, you've got an absolutely brand new presentation, no slides that you've probably seen before in the deck, so it's always very refreshing to have you, Martin.
Thank you very much.
And we've been doing this predictions webinar as our first one for I think the last 4, maybe 5 years overall, so I think a whole range of predictions, presumably sort of new ones and
well, I take Bill Gates's view on life, which is that we tend to overestimate the short-term impact and completely underestimate the long-term impact, which is how I mitigate being accurate or not on this stuff.
Yep.
So over the stretch of those 4 years, I think we're on trend in terms of things that need doing, how fast they turn up. There's a long tail to this market, so there'll be some people in the audience who will be completely on the leading edge of a particular topic, and some people going, gosh, it's just about coming into view. But the fact of the matter is, most of us have to do most of it at some time.
I certainly agree with you on the underestimation. I remember reading a paper back in 1991, I think it was, by UBS, Phillips and Drew, called Bloodbath on the High Street.
Yes.
And it was how with new technology, that was then telephone banking, we wouldn't need high street branches. And from that time until now, it's taken best part of 26 years until we really are now seeing a bloodbath on the high street in terms of.
And it's still only about 15%, by the way, of all retail that e-commerce has taken up. You know, so gosh knows what happens when we get to 50%.
And also delighted to introduce Darren Smith to his first webinar with us from New Voice Media. Darren, you're SVP of Sales Engineering, so which I understand is pre-sales and sales consultancy. So you and your team spend a lot of time out with customers doing proof of concept, understanding what the drivers are, and mapping technology onto that.
Exactly right. So some of the themes that people have drawn up around things like important KPIs, important ROI modeling, looking at how they can get benefit from their contact center solutions. That's where my team spend a lot of time.
And if you'd like to get hold of a copy of today's webinar, it will be available from about 3 o'clock. That's at callcenterhelp.com/recorded webinars. Just a little bit of housekeeping. If you'd like to log into our chat room, here's the address. Here is very separate from the other chat areas, and it's in a separate window from the main webinar. So if you have one for chat, one for webinar, perhaps put them next to each other so you can see both that are going on. As an added advantage being in there, that if you have a tip, a prediction, or a question, and we are going to give a bottle of champagne or a box of chocolates or an Amazon voucher for the best tip or the best prediction. So if you'd like to use hashtag tip for tip, hashtag prediction for prediction, and hashtag question, then we can see much more easily which one is which. And we've been asking the question, what is your biggest priority for 2018? We opened this up just a shade before we came through, and we've got some quite interesting answers. Kate has said driving performance and how to improve quality in the contact center, getting the KPIs right, because I think certainly KPIs drive a lot of behaviors. Alison says creating a single view of the customer and making ourselves GDPR compliant. We have Scott, who said effectively prepare our engineers for the dizzying array of new products coming through. So I guess if you're introducing lots of new products, product knowledge is quite challenging. Reagan has said new channels of contact and KPIs to measure against. So I guess this is things like web chat and perhaps video chat. Kuda said the use of chatbots and process streamlining. Ari has said RPA, which is robotic process automation and chatbots. Micah said the priority is speech analytics. Ruchia said AI and IVRs are some of the, so we're starting to see artificial intelligence coming through as some of the priorities of the people joining. Richard said chatbots, driving efficiency, automation and quality. And Shez has said reduce the reasons for customers needing to make contact, i.e. remove repeat contacts and fix broken processes. So I think some very good areas there. Well, we've got a number of those areas we're going to be touching on in our 10 predictions for this year with a lot more detail. So it's probably the right time if I hand across to Martin Hill-Wilson. And Martin, if you'd pass the baton across to you.
Thank you very much.
And if you'd like to put your slides up on the on the screen and take us through your predictions for 2018.
Thank you very much, Jonty. Okay, so hello everybody. As Jonty said, we have provided these slides to you, so enjoy the relatively quick pace that we will go through these on, and then you've got a chance to share these and debate them at greater time with your team later on. So here's the top 10 predictions. I think they map fairly well against what we've already discussed, and I think the point really I would like to make in mitigation is that whether or not they appear on your personal list obviously depends on your own personal priorities, but they are generally industry-wide themes that at some point, either this year or in the future, you're going to have to address in some form or the other. So with that being said, let's take this first one about the changing behaviors we can see quite clearly within our customer bases. And again, bearing in mind that we've got a relatively global audience, I am making that statement aware of the fact that these behaviors and trends are pretty much universal. The degree to which they're adopted, I think, is still reasonably specific. You know, so for example, if we had anyone coming out of Singapore or South Korea, for example, today, they may well be seeing certain kinds of communication preferences as opposed to some of the European territories, for example. But it's a matter of degree as opposed to completely. So on the preferences, I've got a rather nice little piece of research from the UK Deloitte consumer survey. By the way, you can download this and look at your own region. But they asked an interesting question to people who use smartphone. And the reason I've picked this is I think one of the things that we need to think about if we're talking about digital customer service is represented within the use of smartphone technology, and not just the technology, but the mindset that goes along with it. You know, the intolerance, not waiting, wanting things instantly, the propensity towards self-service and self-determination, all the things that go with that. And they asked this really interesting question, which is to say, on a given week, how likely are you to use the smartphone for what it was originally done for, which is voice calls? And in 2012, only 4% were not using that device for voice. Go forward just 4 years, and last year, 30% of people weren't relating to their smartphones at all in terms of it being a mechanism for voice calls. So again, that's a very good demonstration of the change of behaviors. And by the way, one thing I say a lot in the masterclasses that I run on this topic is, do you know the percentage of people who are communicating to you over smartphone? And it's just one of those foundation questions that you need to have a grip on, because it does drive a different set of expectations if I'm using a smartphone when I'm talking to you. There's form factor for a start, the options that are available to you in terms of redesigning the service experience, and it's a blind spot for a lot of people if they're not thinking those terms. But one of the aspects of the change is this relative openness to using other channels. Now, again, Jonty's team did some interesting work last year, polling folk who are members of the call center community, and said, so what are you currently investing in? And this, again, is a mirror image of what we've just looked at, which is the investment in other channels. So web chat, I think, is no surprise. That's been on the agenda for a good half dozen years now. Interestingly, it has still got critical mass, as you can see from this, because this is new investment. So people are still building out that channel. The mobile apps, sitting underneath that title, is also the gradual adoption of messaging. And again, I think it's not a surprise to say that there's been a lot of marketing effort to position messaging as the next greatest thing. What I will tell you is that there's no such thing as a silver bullet. It sits within an omni-channel strategy, or should do, It has been positioned as eating email's lunch, as potentially also disrupting web chat. It has got benefits such as asynchronous. In other words, you can continue a conversation over time. And of course, you can position that within apps. You can have it available in many ways. And then you've got people such as Facebook who are about to unleash, their messaging strategy, as is Apple, as is Google, as is all of the big people. So it's very much a trending topic. Whether or not that applies to your customers and whether or not you need to do it this year is something you need to determine, but undoubtedly there's a lot of momentum behind that particular trend. Again, just to re-emphasize what I've said, the argument for messaging is, of course, that in today's world, for some customers, a voice call is slightly too intrusive. Rather like people knocking on your front door at home, you expect somebody to pre-qualify that arrival point. And of course, in our busy world, which is increasingly true for all of us, having our attention grabbed through something such as a live video call, a live telephone call is not necessarily what we want. What we prefer is to be able to multitask, and the asynchronous ability of messaging is correspondingly popular. So that's really one way of looking at it. Another thing that's coming through is, again, under the broader banner of least effort to get outcomes accomplished, is do we still welcome things like keyboards? Do we still welcome the effort to get things done? And there's been a huge amount of experimentation using gesture, speech, touch, sight to try to make the gap between what I want and what I've achieved as simple and low effort as possible. And I just took this next slide from a Forbes article. In fact, it turned up last year, and it's just I think a dramatically interesting headline: the end of typing. The next billion mobile users will rely on video and voice. And that's why I'm such an advocate, by the way, of saying there's no such thing as a silver bullet. In reality, voice, text, and video, whether it's live or self-service, keep iterating and going round in a circle. And it's a mix of those things that matter at the end of the day. But to make the point here, again, the adoption of messaging platforms such as WhatsApp have certainly mattered more to different communities around the world. And, in the absence, for example, of broadband, fixed broadband, of landlines and that kind of thing, the adoption of mobile and messaging platforms such as this have been an incredible facilitation tool, at the end of the day. And again, it's demonstrating that we as brands have to keep up to speed with this very rapid change of behavior that we're seeing within customers. And of course, the interesting thing about messaging is it is omni-channel. You can use it to talk, to type, and for video conferencing. So it's incredibly advanced capability sitting in the hands of our consumers. Our question is, how do we keep pace with that?
And there is a key point that you made there, which I think is really important, which is around the point of platform, that these communication channels are platforms. They aren't just a single point of communication. They're not enclosed. They're very much open. They're able to be integrated with your existing different environments, and you're able to capture all of the kind of elements around communication that you weren't able to capture before. So it's really powerful.
And whether or not we ever see it replicated in more Western context, WeChat is a platform, is an ecosystem, is a whole new world. And in fact, probably represents the online world in a mobile context. So transformational in terms of how that's worked. The other big thing, which I think everybody knows because you all got one in your Christmas stocking this year, in one form or the other, is the massive race that's going on, primarily between Amazon and Google right now, between who owns the household, in terms of voice being a form and a mechanism and an interface to get things done. And the thing that this slide is really saying is how agile, I suppose, Amazon has been in building out that capability. I was saying on our practice run when we were doing this yesterday that I read a stat last week that says Amazon is now the biggest seller of speakers in the world. Not because it wishes to be, but simply because that has become such a powerful way in which to get the Alexa capability out to marketplace at the end of the day. And again, Google is chasing very hard. Most of us will have had some degree of exposure to that, and it is changing our world very quickly. So again, voice as an automated service, where's that sitting within your customer service strategy? Open question, something that, again, an increasing number of people are beginning to address.
So do you predict at some point we'll be able to talk into our Alexas and connect to a contact center as a, phone British Gas? And
well, I certainly think most people recognize that if the self-service doesn't satisfy the, get to the outcome, you've got to have an escalation path built into there. Yep. It's also interesting to note that Alexa last year in the UK, they did it slightly earlier in the States, launched messaging and telephony on that platform.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. So it's already built into that capability. So yes, absolutely. Alexa, connect me to brand X. Probably the first option will come up is, how can I help you? Let me get it sorted out.
Yeah.
And by the way, I'd like to talk to somebody about this because it's not what I wanted.
Yeah.
Again, a seamless escalation to that, without having to use anything in terms of a traditional device. And of course, the advantage of this stuff is that you can be where you want to be. You can be in the kitchen doing this. You can be in the bedroom doing this. You can be wherever you want. The ubiquity of these devices is the interesting thing. And of course, voice in a car context, which is undergoing its own transformation with the autonomous vehicle stuff. Again, that's really just a mobile intelligent hub, really, isn't it, at the end of the day? And the ability to get stuff sorted through that voice interface, it's just going to keep growing.
And it'd be interesting to know if anyone has actually managed to get an Alexa going in their car. That would be, if anyone in the audience has done that.
Yeah, so actually, anybody on the notes, anybody got an Alexa strategy up and running? Anybody connected up to the service? Anybody trying to drive customer service outcomes through Alexa or Google or any of the others? Dead interesting to hear that. That would be much appreciated. So
we've had a comment back on that. Peter Massey has said that you can talk to your Alexa already, room to room and house to house. By the way, every time I say Alexa, my Alexa is talking back. So Alexa, what is the weather forecast?
Screwing up Peter's opinion. By the way, if you get a chance to see Peter talk on this stuff, he is completely geeked out on all new stuff, on AI, Alexa, etc. And he's really got some great stories. So the next time Peter's profiled, little plug for him. He's really interesting on what he's talking about. So go along and see him.
And we're doing a webinar with Peter as part of this spring schedule.
So second trend, AI gets baked into everything. I mean, I'm sure you couldn't have got through 2017 without being bored to death with this topic. Everybody has been discussing it, and of course, it's going to eventually change everything. I think the interesting thing that I'd like to raise comes from an event I was chairing towards the end of last year, where we were very blessed to have Brian Manusama with us, who was from Gartner, and he really has got a very good perspective on all things to do, particularly with the conversational aspect of AI. And the research that he is privy to and able to assemble says that customer engagement, call centers in particular, have so far proved to be early areas for early adoption within organizations. I found that a really good news story here. And of course, normally the call center is right at the back of the queue in terms of new investment. We suddenly find ourselves thrust to the forefront. So I think that's a really exciting thing to know about. And one of the reasons for that is displayed on this slide, which I very much like, because one of the problems we have in our language at the moment is to talk about AI. And I don't find that terribly useful because it means everything and nothing. It's an umbrella term, and it's much, much more useful to break it down into its components and to start to understand. Now, the one that probably most people are referring to is machine learning, which is the ability to spot patterns and to therefore have something improve without any further human intervention. And on very large data sets, certainly that is useful, and that's all part and parcel. But the stuff that we've probably not known has been around, not really thought about, such as natural language processing, has actually been around the call center for 10 years plus.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've been doing, some people have been investing that into our IVRs for a good while now.
Yeah.
And that's the basis upon why it suddenly appeared so strongly. It hasn't come out of anywhere. It's actually come from a long, slow build of developing language models in particular vertical markets, which now means the recognition level between machines and humans is pretty damn good, isn't it?
Yeah.
Speech to text, text to speech, that's massively important. And I think we're going to talk a little bit more about that later on, aren't we? About how that influences the way in which you can get real-time analysis of conversations taking place in the contact center. Robotics. Let me just give you an example on vision at the bottom there, just to show how it's used. I heard somebody again last year saying they'd been getting hold of image recognition capability and using it for the business they're in, which is basically broken windscreens. And apparently, if the customer uploads an image of a broken windscreen, the image recognition algorithm is so accurate in terms of working out what needs to be the next action that they now couple that with an automated quote system. They're so confident that they're going to get the right outcome that it doesn't even need human mediation with that. Now, what's interesting at that point is, of course, they've completely disrupted everybody else doing it in the traditional route, which is we will come along and send an assessor to have a look at your windscreen and then book you in. Boom, yep, totally changed. So if you have a look at that, you know, there's many aspects of artificial intelligence that directly contribute to customer service. Hence, we're right at the front end of the marketplace. Now, again, trying to understand and break down where it can contribute. Again, this is courtesy of Deloitte's. You'll hear the word cognitive quite often in the context of AI. Cognition, mind, you know, that sort of association. And they break it into three areas, which I have found personally quite useful as a way of categorizing things. I suppose underneath what we're interested in our world, is the ability to surface what is relevant. Now, many of you talked about efficiencies, effectiveness, responsiveness. And I don't know that we're in a year 2018 where this is going to be a completely baked-in solution. But my sense is that particularly the pattern recognition capability within AI will eventually help to surface the most relevant parts of the data that we generate in vast amounts within our call centers. Because the other way of putting that is that we don't benefit from much of what we've currently got. Yeah, MI reporting is hopeless, it's historic. We don't know what to do with most of it. Wouldn't it be marvelous if something was seeing the connection points between data in real time and then pointing back to us where our efficiencies lie, inefficiencies lie, where the productivity gaps are sitting between different advisors, how effective various things are, what are the trending topics. I think we're moving now into a world which will be potentially transformed through AI. Right now, though, the opportunities that we ought to be sitting on are, number one, is the robotic process automation, which a number of you mentioned. I would say my sense of listening to people is that this is probably a well-established trend now that many of us have got hold of. And in particular, I think people who have got front office, middle office kind of relationships, particularly where middle office is process orientated, dealing with paperwork, trying to get things done for customers, there's often a gap as a result, and it's expensive and it's frustrating. Why can't we automate that? And it's a good question, and the answer is yes, you can. And the example I'm giving you here from HMRC is just really one of many, many that have been brought forward, which is to say, let's talk about it as if you know, we've literally replaced a human data entering, doing a repetitive task, and have that as a bot. And I think there's been a lot of effort, mainly because you don't necessarily have to involve central IT. And I know a lot of business leaders that have taken teams and done this work. Yeah. Now, I think there's an interesting thing that comes with it is what happens when you've got a dozen or even 20 of these things up and running. I've started to read material that says, hang about, you've got the next problem of governance coming up, which is how do you deal with the fact you've automated processes when sometimes you swap out the core technologies, you swap out the workflow. How are you going to manage that governance because things break at that point? Yeah. But nonetheless, it's provided a short-term boost to efficiencies, effectiveness, and speed of response. So it's something that a lot of people have had great success with, and I think you know, we're going to see more of it. Now, the reality is, at the simplest level, it's just rules-based. At the top end of the market, there is some intelligence in terms of the AI stuff. There's a lot of different approaches that you can take, but that's undoubtedly something that appeals to lots of sectors. Your research last year, Jonty, also showed that a lot of people are going, yeah, we're doing it and we want to be doing it. So there's a clearly established trend that's in play. You can also use the same sorts of approaches where you look at the way that we relate to customers in terms of engagement, and then we're in the business of whatever you want to call them, intelligence assistants, virtual assistants, chatbots, or whatever. And the thing that probably makes the difference from the previous generation of self-service is represented in that picture in front of you. And for me, this is the trigger, because in fact, we have a hopeless or very strong desire as human beings to anthropomorphize anything we see in front of us. And in fact, what you're looking at is a couple of a couple of fixtures on a door, but what somebody's seen, in fact, is a face. And that's represented very clearly on the right-hand side of the page, which is if you're good, and it undoubtedly needs design, good at conversational design and the automation of that, you are far more likely to have customers stay in that flow, as with good IVR design, than if you simply have a bunch of FAQs sitting on a page which is too hard to find. And most people are now starting generation 1.
And I think what's quite interesting on that slide, Martin, is very much around the fact that in that chatbot example you gave, it's not a picture of a human, it's a picture of a sort of like a robot.
Yeah.
So you get the idea that you are speaking with a robot. And I think that's one of the tricks that I think a lot of people are missing. They're putting in chatbots pretending to be people, rather than chatbots pretending to be, saying, I'm a robot, how can I help you? And if you get stuck, I'll put you through to
Well, do you know what, just one little point there, as a side thing, I read a really interesting article which makes a great deal of sense to us. As humans, we are exceedingly flexible in how we talk to different communities and groups. So, for example, think on this. You speak to your children in a certain way. You speak to your parents in a certain way. You speak to your university buddies in a certain way, and you probably speak to your taxman in a certain way. Well, we just modify our behavior naturally. Chatbots is just another group. So there's no big deal about trying to take a chatbot and make it identical to a human. We don't need that. What we do need is an effective way of engagement that gets us to an outcome. And we're quite happy to modify our behavior at our end to make it work.
And that's it for me. Does it get me to the right outcome? And if not, is the point of escalation very easy and straightforward to get me through to a human? It's very simple.
So the conversational aspect of this is certainly growing. Gartner is actually quite modest here in terms of the degree of uplift. I actually think that some people might get there much more rapidly than that within the next couple of years. But the place to start, by the way, is modestly. And the only thing I would say is that since so many of us have talked about AI, I think it's the honest thing is to say that we're still all learning. What we tend to do, therefore, is make up stuff that we don't really know what we're talking about. And last year, a lot of people made up a lot of stuff and got rather overexcited by what we've seen in the movies, in all honesty. So what we do need to do is to avoid what Brian has just, he's allowed to do because he's Gartner, the trough of disillusionment, which is just around the corner. In fact, it's due to happen in Q1 of this year. And really what we should do is to take a use case that's going to work for us. And probably the best one is go to your website, go and look at your FAQs and make that work in a conversational context. And that gives you a bedrock upon which to build. Because one of the interesting things about this tech is it's hot in terms of innovation. So 2018, 2019, 2020 will all have different capability you can use. So there's no point trying to be too clever this year. Just get your ROI within the confines of the tech, then be ready for the next, then be ready for the next. That's a much smarter way of working. And right now, probably the easiest thing to do is to focus there as your ground rule. The last thing you want is to upset your organization with a failed AI project. It's too important to miss that thing. Next one is where AI can contribute to working with advisors. And I must say, we had that scare, didn't we, that everyone's going to get replaced with a robot and all that nonsense. And I think I saw during the middle of last year this idea that there'd be a collaboration, I think, between AI and humans. And here is a good example of what I think we would increasingly see, which is where we have got some intelligence sitting in the background, which helps to identify needs in real time and then assist the advisor in producing the right assets to pass on to the customer. And to bring that to life, here is a good example, which is apparently in play as we speak. So we start off with some stuff which is probably quite familiar. Core ID comes in, we know who they are because CRM tells us who that person is. We also do some intelligent things at that level and say, gosh, that's interesting. They haven't actually talked to us to 10 years. However, they have called the rescue line. And by the way, we also know that when people such as this person, which in this instance is called Liddy, call, it's because they actually really do need help. Therefore, it's a priority. We also happen to know by pulling in another data set that where she is, because we know the postal code, actually it's jolly cold and probably we need to act with an urgency. So what we now know is that we've prioritized that call, we've brought it forward to live assistance, And also we have used the fact that we know where Lily is to update where she physically has presumably broken down. And we start to listen into that conversation between advisor and customer. And the virtual assistant in the background is using some relatively simple capability, keyword, and picks up relevant keywords. And this particular thing, the discussion that ended up with the decision that said, you know what, you're going to need a tow, all right, in order to be able to get you home. At that particular point, there's an intervention that says, right, let's then show where the closest options are in terms of people that can provide that service. Customer, however, isn't quite sure which one to choose because she is stuck in an unfamiliar location. So the virtual assistant says, look, shall we actually help her out by showing a photograph of a local landmark? That's a nice proactive suggestion to the advisor, who goes, yeah, that's a good idea, let's push that forward. Therefore, the VI executes on that idea, the customer confirms it, and then the VA therefore updates the map with the chosen truck tow option. And then we'll deliver on the rest of the job to be done, which is basically to send the details to that driver, to work out the estimated wait time on the advisor's screen, and then presumably to provide continuous update until that person is safely home at the end of the day. And again, I think that that is a scenario that we will increasingly see, which is when live assistance is required, because it's emotional, complex, and matters to the relationship. We're still going to see that kind of intelligent assistance hovering invisibly in the background to help improve the productivity and the customer experience outcomes for all concerned. And I think that's a great example in terms of that capability. Right. Having said all those things, the last thing I'd like to say before we have a quick little break and ask for people's opinion is to say, what kind of culture are we needing to keep an eye on as we're beginning to evolve? Because what we've really said so far is that we're looking at an increasingly sophisticated form of engagement, more options. We're also saying we can see some of those calls being hived off more successfully to self-service, and therefore the remaining outstanding live calls are going to be more complicated and require a certain kind of culture to go with it. And I stumbled across this really interesting piece of research from Harvard Business Review, which is just done towards the end of middle of last year, where they talked to 7,500 service reps across 38 different companies. I think that was globally as well. And they said, in terms of the culture you're sitting in, what best describes it? And they had three ways in which to summarize that. An adherence culture, where basically what you will advise a customer is driven out of what you've been taught in terms of policy and procedure. So it's pretty much imitating company rules, in other words. The next one is individual judgment, where your own expertise and experience drives your decision making. I think that's where quite a few of us are with an empowered culture. I think that's when we were talking about that. That's probably the result of it. But there's a third one, which is interesting, which is called network judgment, where in fact we are really tapping into the collective wisdom of colleagues. And guess what? If you had to then say which culture is most typical, this is the split. And I don't think there's any surprise on that. We're still in a command control culture primarily, and split the other two between 35 and 12%. Now, the interesting question here is, which of those cultures is most effective from the customer's perspective? And some of you might actually guess it's number 3. And that is as measured by the impact it has on customer effort, the impact it has on satisfaction, and also on productivity of the advisors. Now, you might go, well, that's interesting, but why is that the case? I think there's a perfectly plausible explanation which they provide with the research, which is this. Now that we have got more self-service, the average issue that is finally making it through to live assistance is much more complicated, far less predictable. In that environment, you're not going to be able to reduce that to a set of scripts or checklists as easily. Therefore, the wisdom of the collective, I suppose, is what we're saying here. And new and unique customer issues coming up every minute makes much more sense to leverage peer wisdom, experience, and lessons learned. You get a better outcome. Now, I must say, if you follow the logic of that research and you buy into it, it raises a dead interesting question. How do you facilitate that flow then and enable people to work in that kind of collaborative thing? Because there's tech that can facilitate that. There is team meeting activity and all of that shared activity, and how are you going to make those things take place? Anyway, That is the last thing to be said about the culture, but I'd like to pass that question back to you now and say, okay, so right now, what kind of culture are you sitting in? An adherence one, individual judgment one, or this network judgment one? And just hand over to Jonty to take us through that process.
Yes, so the voting in the poll is, what type of culture are you? Are you adherence? Are you individual judgment, or are you network judgment? If you'd like to vote on that, it's in the poll window in the centre of your screen. So if you'd just like to fill in the details there. Martin, do you expect this to fit very much in with the
Well, it's a funny thing. We have actually given previous figures on that, haven't we? And I would say that I think plus or minus we're going to be fairly close to that. I still think, well, the work I've done on quality management, the culture sitting there, we still sit pretty strongly in adherence cultures, I'm afraid to say. And I still think because of efficiency and cost effectiveness, most people instinctively go for command and control, thinking that's the best way to do it, which I don't think.
Well, let's have a look. The sample size is 155.
Yeah.
And wow, look at that. 56% adherence,
Pretty spot on.
26% individual judgment, and 12% network judgment. So that is pretty broadly. Bearing in mind you've told everyone what the best answer would be.
I hope we didn't condition that. That's not interesting.
Yeah. You've seen perhaps a slight uptake in the ideal answer there.
So I would like to say to people that's an interesting outcome if you follow the logic of what we've said so far, and you're building out a different way of engaging and starting to redefine the role of live, you might really think quite seriously about this issue on culture and what is most appropriate. Because I do buy the logic behind that piece of research, and it probably means most of us need to migrate. Yeah.
And there's always a baseline, isn't there? I think the baseline for most people is going to be adherence. But then depending on the product and the service that you're offering will perhaps depend how much of the individual or network judgment you blend.
Yes.
Once you've gone past that initial boot camping, education, training of your agents as well. I think all three of them come into play quite naturally.
Yeah. I mean, I haven't talked about it because it's just too much to say, but the skill implication, the recruitment profile.
Yeah.
I hope sometime soon we're going to have a conversation about money. I know we don't want to, but the fact is, as that skill set gets greater, we do need to recognize it in different new ways. Anyway, that's a future thing, but interesting stuff there.
Well, it's now time for some top tips and questions from the audience. The chat room has been flowing in very quickly. A couple of predictions. Arlene has said, I predict that web chat in contact centers will increase greatly in 2018. We've certainly seen a lot of people investing in that. And for chatbots to become more sophisticated. I think that's quite Richard says we'll be moving from silo systems to that contact centers run into one unified system that has got it all. Darren, I think that's something that you've been very passionate about for a while.
Yeah, very much so. I think that's been the root of a number of kind of the areas around measurement and KPI and emotional happiness for both the customers and the agents in terms of their experience. We've always wanted to get that single version of the truth, single version of service. I think it continues. I think that ball is going to be rolling for quite some time.
We touched on voice recognition. Aria said voice recognition is great if the language is supported. In a country like South Africa with 11 official languages, it's more of a challenge. So perhaps easy to get the English and a bit more difficult to get Swahili or.
Well, I do know. To that end, and I've been out in South Africa a number of times, that there are people starting to build the core data sets to enable that. So it will change over the next couple of years.
Indeed. Jonathan asked a question, do you think the volume of available data metrics reporting across multiple streams, artificial intelligence, IVR, speech analytics, will outstrip the call center's ability to process and interpret an action? I think Martin mentioned on artificial intelligence might give some.
Absolutely, big fan. I think it already has done, even before we started all this nonsense. Yeah, MI has always been a very thin end of a big wedge, and it's always been historic, and it's been rubbish at the end of it. It's been far too hard. It's an interesting point when people walk around businesses going, "Ooh, where's the big data?" That we should have said, "It's sitting here in our call center. Why don't you apply the big mincing machine to it?" And I do think there is a big opportunity which hasn't yet come fully into focus, which is to put everything, such as you mentioned there, Jonathan, into a data lake and put one instance of machine learning over the top, because there's a very complicated set of relationships between advisors, customers, and topics.
And Darren, do you think analytics is one part of that, or do you think it will become the overlay layer?
I think analytics is only one part of that. I think there's a number of layers that are going to be able to help drive the insights, the behaviors, and all the other aspects that people want in order to be more efficient, more helpful, and everything in their contact centers. It's just one part of that entire picture, but it's an enormous amount of data to tap into, absolutely enormous, and it is potentially overwhelming.
But to quote something that again Peter will know well, stop doing dumb things to customers.
Yeah,
I do think that some of the future strategy around getting better at that comes from precisely what Jonathan was talking about, which is we can't expect to see it sitting in a report.
Yeah,
we've got to have a situation where it's been automatically recognized, identified, and through alerts pushed to the right communities of people in real time so we can act on it.
It's not just analytics. No. It is driving behavior.
So Peter has said, I don't know if it's the same Peter, bots don't replace designing and deciding on business rules. What do you want to happen? What trends are you seeing to companies recognizing and skilling and resourcing this? Have you seen things in terms of deciding business rules?
Well, I'm not quite sure what the questions are there, but what I will say is that the more we go into conversational design mode, and this was happening anyway, quite frankly, through customer experience, there are a whole new number of roles that are going to be needed within a contact center environment. And it's everything from just basically getting the journey correct down to specific conversations, skill, for example, around of how you communicate in different contexts and channels. I mean, for example, to make the obvious point, a letter is written differently from a message. Yes. The way in which you can hear people like Wally Brill, for example, who works for Google Assistant, talk about voice design is actually reminiscent of natural language in IVR design.
Yeah.
And if that's not done well, you've wasted all your money on the tech. So the more in which this intelligent self-service comes forward, we will need to think much more carefully and cleverly about that. And still, most of these systems, and he makes an important point there, are still actually going to be business rule driven. You know, at the end of the day. So knowing what business rules and how to build flexibility into that is, again, another huge area.
But it's only one part of it, right? It's only one part of it. It then becomes the human engagement aspect, which is the skill that perhaps is more missing inside businesses today.
Well, we've got one more prediction before we jump on to jump on back into Martin's predictions. And Jamie says customer experience measures will become more important to service desks than traditional KPI measures. Jamie, I really agree with that.
Amen.
We have a article that's going to be coming out in the next month where we asked all our readers to vote on the top 10 contact center metrics. And for the first time ever, average handling time no longer features in the top 10.
Wow.
And that's been quite a sea change. Very important if you're going to do an airline calculation, but otherwise it certainly doesn't make a good agent target. So let's just jump back into Martin. I think you've got 4 more predictions
we'll motor on
before we finish.
So I want to address an issue, which is that, you know, we've hyped multi-channel, omni-channel for years and years and years. In reality, it remains voice which takes the heavy load. Web chat is growing fast, as a number of us have mentioned. Messaging might suddenly have a breakthrough. It's only going to get more complicated. One of the implications with all of that is, are we good at managing a conversation over a number of channels? I'm afraid to say we're not. And there's a great piece of research that, well, actually you did a great piece of research. So this is your voice coming back to us, which says half of you kind of think yes, you know, a fifth of you think no, and a third of you say sometimes. I actually think it's a little bit worse than that. And I'm a great fan of Eptica's research, where they do 100 brands every single year. They ask very, very simple, obvious questions, but they ask the same question over voice, SMS, email, social, chat. What's terrifying is, are people able to give the same answer consistently and all the rest of it? So here's the 17 outcome, we're not doing terribly well here in terms of the ability to answer the same question over all of the advertised channels you say you are present on. And unfortunately, it gets even worse when we say, was that an answer that actually delivered me what I wanted, or am I have to ask you again and follow up? So first call resolution in effect. And again, we found that it's gone backwards, and none would, that's it, customer experience research, which came out quite recently as well, end of last year, have the same insight on the UK, which is actually we've gone backwards on customer experience in terms of some of these fundamentals. So ask yourself these questions. I know the answer, by the way, but it's still a good rhetorical question. How would you feel if, you know, an airline gets asked the same question on Twitter, which is a public pressure point, so therefore can do it in under 30 minutes, but for some reason actually takes 4 days to do it on email? Now, the thing behind that is operationally, how the heck are you managing those teams? Yeah, why is it that the email team, the voice team, the social team just aren't joined up? You know, I think social, if it's done anything in half dozen years, has upped our standards. Why aren't we sending back those insights and those greater capabilities to some of the more legacy teams? It seems ridiculous. Why, when we sit down with the site manager, presumably managing these siloed teams, are we not pooling our insight and you know, working in a more intelligent way? I think it's not really excusable.
And I think the danger is if you have conversations like this where you're taking 4 days to respond on email. If I was managing the perception of my company, I'd want people to be contacting me by email privately rather than complaining publicly on Twitter. So to my mind, it's almost the wrong way around.
Well, actually, it's a new voice media customer that turned me onto this. It's Jag from SHL, what it used to be. And he said, you know, we had something like a 4-day SLA. And he looked at it and went, why are we spending that time on email? Why don't we do it in a couple of hours? And he just said, there's no reason why we're not. It's just because it's the tradition around here. And he took 40% of voice traffic out because, in fact, the requirement was much better delivered within a half-day period. You know, provided it was done by midday or before we left, that's all I needed in terms of an answer. So it's send it and forget it. It worked perfectly well over email. So email, for whatever reason, has got stigmatized through absolutely poor SLAs, unnecessarily so. Anyway, having ranted about that point, I could say that on a number of channels, but, you know, here's the stats. Again, New Voice Media has done some good work in previous years about the cost of, you know, not doing things well and us voting with our feet. This is interesting simply because it's the ombudsman who's actually produced this, who's not given to hysteria and hyperbole, but again, he marks the amount of money that's been, you know, lost at a pretty high level as a result of that. So again, inconsistency of experience through mismanagement of channels is not a clever thing to do. And go and do what basically the Eptica research does, which is drink your own champagne, ask the questions across the channels and find out the consistency level and fix it. Needs fixing. Okay, another conversation is mobile. I still think a lot of us are in denial about the fact that we are in a mobile world. And just to demonstrate some of the core stats around of it, it's interesting to say what's the propensity overall with 18+ people in the UK to use a laptop or a desktop versus a smartphone. And if you zero in on the 2017 stat, we're even Stevens, in fact, just slightly nudging ahead on smartphone. And then guess what, in the future, increasingly we are smartphone oriented. So therefore, it follows a higher percentage of your customers should be engaging with you in that way. What are you doing to accommodate that? And one of the most interesting points about a smartphone device is, of course, it's not really just one that you're using for talking. It's got a bunch of sensors in it. It's got all sorts of amazing tech sitting inside it, which if you really get to think about it, allows you to redefine how you deliver service. Now, Marriott is by no means the only company doing it well. A mobile app is by no means the only way in which you deliver a mobile experience. However, the thing that's nice about what they're doing here is they've taken 4 of their core journeys, the booking, the traveling, the checking in, the service, and they have made that work in a really successful way. They recognize the importance of doing that to their customer groups. So again, what are we doing? And this is you know, it's a not filled in framework, but it's the one that I use in one of the master classes, simply to say, if you have got a mobile customer, what are you doing if they're coming into your contact center, if they're going over your website, if they're doing it via an app, if they're doing it via messaging? You know, what are your challenges here. For example, visual IVR is terrifically important within the context of the smartphone. Don't even think about a non-responsive website if you're going to be doing mobile. You know, apps, for example, are still weighted, unfortunately, towards where's the customer service tab, because most of them were built by marketing people. And as Darren said earlier on, you know, messaging is not an app, it's a platform, it's an ecosystem. So if you take that basic framework and then say, what are you doing in terms of proactive, self-service and live assistance, filling in that process and thinking it through allows you to think, gosh, in fact, delivering a mobile experience is substantially different from the one that we currently got. So again, think on that. Very quickly, the last 2 points I want to make is, guess what? This is finally the year in which GDPR finally does arrive in the not too distant future. You know, I suppose the summary of that is to say the mindset is about the fact that the data is loaned to us rather than we've nicked it and we own it at all costs. And I think the most interesting thing is everything we've said to date implies our ability to mine more and more of the customer data for altruistic reasons maybe, but GDPR says how, and by the way, the answer to that exam question is you've got to build trust, because then it's an equal exchange of value. So I think there's some interesting things about how we change our engagement strategy, how we survive some of the obvious standards that GDPR are imposing, and maybe the one interesting one is to say, in our value chain of suppliers, technologies, data suppliers, who is accountable? The answer GDPR gives is everybody is to some degree or not. Have you got that clear yet with the people that make your customer service ecosystem work? Here is a little set of exam questions that you should just stick on your wall and ask yourself. I like it. I'm not going to spend any time on it right now, but download it, print it, and have it on there. It's quite a good little mnemonic for thinking GDPR mindset. And then the last area I want to say is that, you know, without good data and without great analytics, the world that we're imagining just does not exist. And it can be called all sorts of different things and used in all sorts of different ways. But this is the thing that really is the difference between old style contact center world and new style. It's personalized, it's intelligent, it's appropriate, it's real time, it's got feedback loops, it's informed, and it's ahead of the game, it's not on the back foot, and it's transformative. All of those things are turning data into actionable insight, which is a tough thing to do, but again, probably as a strand, if we did the next 25 years together, Jonty, on this, we should always have a slide on this, because it's always, you know, going to kind of be important. And just as a final thing is, let's just have a little bit of a focus on the speech analytics things, mainly because I know you guys have done some interesting things. We've been talking actually before we started today's session and having a look at what you call it, conversational analyzer.
Conversation analyzer, yeah.
Yeah, that was pretty impressive actually. That was interesting.
It's a really exciting piece of technology. Obviously, we're within the industry. We've had speech analytics for quite some time, expensive on-premise implementations and so on. It's not new. In our consumer lives, we're bombarded with the Amazon Alexa tech, Google, Siri, all of these kind of things, but bringing some of that technology together to really unlock what has been completely hidden from everyone in business around recordings of conversations that are happening in your contact center. Aside from how long that took, what the potential CRM outcome was, a case was closed, an opportunity was closed, and so on. We have an enormous black hole of data that's completely missing, that we can maybe pick some random data set from for less than 1% of all of our conversations. The rise of some of this technology this year, I think, is going to be amazing and really untap and provide a huge amount of insight from what is today ultimately a black hole.
And I certainly, you know, have added my voice over the years to it, and I think we've got to, I think your latest figures said about 20% of the market have invested in some form of that.
And speech analytics, yeah.
And you know, I think the interesting thing is that you brought it to market at a transformative price point, really.
Yeah.
And again, welcome that, because again, we really ought to have at least 50% plus of the market using this, because once you get it, it's transformative, isn't it?
Totally. You're going from having no insight at all to, you know, not 100%, because transcription technologies are not perfect. We're not getting 100% accuracy for text transcription or speech transcription, but you're going from 0 to 60, 70, 80% on day one, which is absolutely mind-blowing.
Yeah, and the difference for me in terms of generation is that you're doing that now in a real-time context.
Correct.
Yeah, so I think that's the other interesting thing. So there's a little bit.
And if anyone would like a demonstration, I think the product we saw earlier was called a conversation analyzer, which can analyze for things like politeness, compliance, effectiveness, professionalism. Just put your details into the survey box at the end of the webinar, and we can arrange for Darren to arrange that for you.
So last thing, get your voice back into the agenda. So given that, which is what we've gone through, I know we initially asked you some questions, what matters to you this year, but of the ones that we've touched on today, self-service, chatbots, all that kind of good stuff, or whatever, the consistency aspect of as you grow out your omni-channel, focused on mobile, that change of culture, GDPR, what's going to be the #1 thing through which you see all of your effort this year? You're only allowed to choose one of them. So which is the one that you're going to focus all of your transformation around of this year? Would love to hear the outcome on that one.
Well, let's have a look at what the audience have voted. I'll just close
I really
off
don't know what we're going to say on this one.
It's interesting, yeah.
Darren, what's your guess going to be?
Yeah.
Oh, well, there we go.
46%.
Self-service, I say.
You must have a magic.
Amazing.
Followed by 26% omni-channel consistency, 15% upgraded culture, 7% on mobile and GDPR. So a range of different options there. We've got time for a couple of tips and opinions on the whole business of multi-channel, omni-channel. Alison said, email is a difficult channel as it does not enable a conversation, and if complex can drag on, so we prefer other channels.
Sure.
And therefore we deprioritize email and encourage our customers to chat or phone.
Sure.
So that perhaps explains why the slow response.
I agree, but just as a pure matter of theory, I could have a real-time conversation with you on email if you chose to be responsive, and I chose to be responsive. But most of us don't. So I will concede the point. But there's not as much. It's not as bad as it seems on email. Is what the point I'm about to make. By the way, most of us still use Outlook or Exchange, which is the wrong product for email management in a call center.
Indeed.
Yeah, where you're getting people to look in a box and going, where should it have gone to? Anyway.
And also on digital, Kate has said we've had to put web chat on hold as it's taking longer than calls to get responses from customers.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
The average stats I see is the average handling time on a web chat is about twice as long as a phone call.
It's taking longer than
and so, it can be one where I know it's sort of very much one of choice. And some people prefer web chat. For instance, if you're in a train, it's a lot more comfortable to have a web chat than it is a phone call explaining all your
Well, as a general
problems.
point, the thing that's attracted people to web chat is that I can multitask and talk to the advisor at the same time. And the advisor's gone, well, I can talk to 2 or 3 customers at the same time too, mutual interest. Now we're getting to a tipping point where customers are going, hang about, you're ignoring me now, I know what you're doing, you're talking to somebody else. Now, messaging directly promotes this idea, you can come back when it's convenient to you. Now, what that's going to be, we might have a bunch of outstanding conversations that never get completed and signed off, as we're extending the ability to do it over time. So it's going to be a mixed blessing, this point.
And on the subject of web chat, if anyone in the audience knows, I was asked a question yesterday in the Call Center Helper forum, which is, does anyone know of a solution that can do secure payments over web chat? So if you know the answer to that, drop me a line. Aria said, a prediction, contact centers will finally be seen as a value revenue generating center as opposed to a cost center. I've certainly seen that for a while. Yeah. And we've got a question from Nicola who says, how long will it be before AI becomes the norm? So I'll just ask our 2 pundits for a quick opinion on that.
It already is on certain sectors and certain markets, is my simple answer. So overall in the world, it's going to take 5-10 years to bake into everything. But if you went to go and talk to Google, they've swapped out their slogan, which says mobile first to AI first, and they know that their future is predicated in it. So if you lived in Google world, it is normalized.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think the, historically, when we've looked at some of these technologies, they've been very much business first technologies. That's been completely turned on its head. It's now consumer first technologies. And the reality is that the people who are providing those, the Googles, the Apples, the Amazons, are increasingly pushing into the business market. So we're going to get those things very, very quickly, but we've already got the baseline of them today.
Indeed. Well, we've now reached the top of the hour, so in 1 or 2 words, if you'd like to put into the chat room, what did you like best about today's webinar? If you want to watch a replay, that will be available in about an hour's time. That's at callcenterhelper.com/recorded webinars. And we have a winning tip. And today's winning tip is Jamie, who predicted that customer experience measures will become more important to service desks, I think for contact centers general, than traditional KPI measures. So we'll be in touch with you about your bottle of champagne or your box
well done,
of
Jamie.
chocolates. And just when you leave the webinar, if you'd like to fill out our post-webinar survey, it's only 4 questions long, so it doesn't take very long. And if you'd like a demonstration of the new Voice Media Conversation Analyzer, just put that into the box. We're going to be back in a week's time where we look at 7 ways to improve quality in the contact center. Just like to thank Martin Hill-Wilson from New Voice Media. Thank you very much.
No. From Brain Food.
Sorry, from Brain Food, and Darren Smith from New Voice Media.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Bye-bye.